We will take clarifications now. Mr. Louis Ng.
Thank you, Madam. I was quite excited for a while when SM said we would reach half our emissions by 2030, but then he burst my bubble. But I really hope that we can try to reach net zero emissions by 2050. If not, could I ask whether we can at least narrow the time frame? So instead of by the second half of the century, which could be 79 years' time, and I was hoping we can actually see net zero emissions within my lifetime. But if we can at least reduce it, I mean, maybe by 2060 or 2070. If not, can the government at least consider to focus it on a per-sector basis? So something like what MOE has done, which is that 20% of the schools will achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. A second question really is for MOE as well, on whether when can we expect the other 80% of schools to reach carbon neutrality? A third, I think Minister Tan mentioned about how we are planning to import hydropower from Lao PDR, and that sounds environmentally friendly, but I just wonder whether we've also studied the environmental impact of building this hydroelectric power station, how destructive it is for the environment there and for the wildlife. And I hope that MTI can consider not just importing the renewable energy, but making sure that it doesn't have that big an impact on the environment in other countries. Thank you.
SM Teo.
Indeed, Madam. I think inherent in the series of questions that Mr. Louis Ng asked is all the trade-offs that we have to balance when we try and achieve the targets that he's talking about. One of the things which we have to consider is whether we want to import electricity. Other jurisdictions, for example, claim to want to achieve these targets, but actually they're importing nuclear energy from their neighbors. So is that something which Mr. Louis Ng thinks is a good idea? I mean, there are different things that we need to do. So when we are considering importing clean and green energy from other countries, there are also other considerations which we have to take into account. So all these things inherently have trade-offs. So our targets, our LEDS by 2050, are based on what we can control ourselves. And all the things that we are doing in all the different sectors within our control, we will do that to bring our emissions down by half to zero. So that's about, I mean, roughly speaking, half of what we emit we can control. The other half depends on what other people do and whether or not we're able to develop the technologies, some of which don't exist today. We're able to get importation of electricity, whether we're able to get carbon markets to work properly. And those are not things which are wholly within our control. So, and as Mr. Louis Ng said himself, even if we did all that, we have to consider the other consequences of all those actions. So these are imponderables which we need to consider with the passage of time. I'm not in the business of bursting bubbles, and I certainly do not want to create a bubble which future generations will have difficulty trying to meet. We do not make promises which will cause future generations problems in trying to keep as well. I think Mr. Louis Ng will probably agree with that.
Mr. Lawrence Wong.
Madam Chair, on Mr. Ng's question on the school sector, we have some schools getting into net zero by 2030. Mr. Ng asked what's the time frame for the rest of the school sector. Well, we'll strive to do this as soon as possible. Certainly, I hope within my lifetime, but you know, post 2030, we will try very hard to get all schools to be net zero. It's not so difficult for the school sector compared to the whole of Singapore. But beyond just putting in the infrastructure to achieve net zero, what I had highlighted earlier, which I think is much more important, is to get mindsets to change And we want to inculcate in our young students, in our students from an early age, the mindset of sustainability, to appreciate the importance of habits. I think that's far more important than just putting in solar panels and then putting in new technology and getting the school infrastructure to be net zero. That we will do. I think that for schools, because it's more compact, it's relatively easier. But getting the software, getting the understanding, the habits and the mindsets, that's an important endeavor we want to do in the school sector as well.
Minister Tan See Leng.
I thank Mr. Louis Ng for that question. For the import from Laos, in terms of the hydropower, it is a pilot, and we will consider all possible sources of renewable energy. And one of the key aspects of this thing would be that we will be getting all prospective importers to submit information on their energy sources, as well as environmental studies that have been done to see what the impact are. And that's why, at this particular point in time, it's still a pilot. We are piloting from Laos, we are also piloting from Malaysia. And as we learn more in the months and in the years ahead, we will collate and find the best way forward. Thank you.
Mr. Sakiandi.
Madam Chairman, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all ministers for sort of giving a very detailed explanation, and SM for a detailed explanation on this issue. I've got two questions for Minister Tan. First is on the switches. You mentioned the range of switches, the regional grid switch, for example, and it was answered somewhat. But first question is on the weightage of the regional grid, and how many percent is it as a whole part of the switch consolidation? Second is I'm concerned on the impact on electricity prices for Singaporeans. And maybe you can share with us to reassure Singaporeans over the next 5 to 10 years, the impact on the increase in prices. Because you mentioned that the electricity prices will normalize, one. Second, data centers and digitalization and EV charging will come on stream, second. And then the switches onboarding, including our exposure to regional grid exposures, three. So maybe you can ask Minister how we can share the plans to mitigate this rise in prices, if there is any going forward, given the possibility of convergence of these factors. Thanks, Minister.
Minister Tan See Leng.
Thank you. Madam Chairperson, as far as the weightage in terms of the four switches is concerned, as I've alluded to earlier on, I think at this particular point in time, we are still managing it in a form of a very fine balance. And as I've started in my speech, we are really in this trilemma. And what I'm hoping to achieve in terms of a message is to send a message to everyone, and I hope to get the support of everyone in the House, that a fundamental pillar that underpins the entire four-switch strategy is really energy conservation. At this particular point in time, in terms of the regional power grid, they are pilots. We are trying to see how we can diversify and how reliable and how resilient and how hedged we can be in terms of applying our diversification strategy in terms of these energy imports from the different countries that is part of this regional ASEAN grid itself. So we are not able to commit to a long-term target in terms of how much percentage weightage we're going to give to each one of this switch itself. What we are doing is that we are accelerating all three of them contemporaneously. The regional power grids we're exploring. We are also working very closely under the RIE initiative in terms of looking at the R&D of developing low-carbon alternatives, and of course going very, very long into renewable energy as well. I think with time, we should be able to provide this House with greater clarity and details of that strategy and how much traction we are able to gain. Thank you.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you to ministers, including Senior Minister Teo, for sharing the more intricate details of the green plan. I think for just as a observer, as Singaporean looking at this, the targets are a very interesting part of the plan, because with technology moving so quickly, sometimes I can imagine it is difficult to say when a certain thing can happen by. I've got two questions. One was actually pertaining to a point that Senior Minister raised with regard to the trade-offs that Senior Minister alluded to in reply to Member Louis Ng's question about nuclear power. And there is, I recall seeing in the government financial statements a consultancy study that was done to study the prospect of the safe disposal of nuclear waste. And this was, I think, about almost in excess of a $2 million study. I can file a parliamentary question on this matter as to what were the findings of the government. But certainly in terms of clean power, that is one of those, a source that potentially should be looked at. So it'll be helpful to know what the government's findings were in that regard. My second question is for Minister Desmond Lee. I think we've read in the mainstream media allusions to how land, forested areas should be dealt with, just like how we deal with our fiscal reserves, very carefully with a second key almost. And my question is for the public to better understand the trade-offs, because it is a sensitive subject for members of the public to have open areas, green lungs in the country. What sort of processes take place in government to ensure that the trade-off that is taken to, for example, remove a forested area is a very careful one, and there are checks and checks and balances in that process to make sure that all other alternatives have been considered carefully. Thank you.
SM2.
Could I just ask Mr. Pritam Singh whether he says that government should study nuclear power as an option?
So I'm not saying that because I don't have information on what could be the impact of that study or that proposal. But it would appear that the government has looked into it. So it would be helpful to know what the government's position is.
SM2.
The government's position on nuclear power is quite clear, and we've said so several times. We are not foregoing this as a long-term option, and we don't give up any of the options that are available. However, we do not see the current generation or the coming, in fact, even the 1.5 generations down, the kinds of nuclear power plants as being suitable for deployment in Singapore. But we are keeping a very close eye on new developments in nuclear power plants to see whether sometime in the future, as the safety and the capabilities, the safety and the inherent safety of nuclear power plants make them viable or feasible for Singapore. But we keep an open mind to this. And we're looking even at nuclear fusion, tokamaks and things like that. We also have to study, and I'm not sure whether this is in fact the study that, so we fund a Singapore center, a research center for nuclear and nuclear safety in Singapore in order to keep a watch on all these issues, including nuclear safety, because although we may not develop nuclear power plants in Singapore, our neighbors may well do so. And so we need to understand the safety implications of nuclear power plants within a certain radius of us. The other thing which we need to be prepared for, and this may well be the subject of the study, I don't know which study that Mr. Pritam Singh is referring to, we need to be prepared for nuclear contamination in Singapore, either through a nuclear accident somewhere in the region or by deliberate action, say a terrorist action with a dirty bomb. And so we have to look at how, if we clean up such a device or such nuclear radioactive substances that have been dispersed in Singapore, say by a terrorist action, how we collect them and how we clean them up. And we have actually plans for such a thing, and we have to think ahead, and we do have plans for this. And so this may well be what Mr. Pritam Singh was thinking of. I don't know, because I don't know the specific reference. Thank you, Madam.
Minister Desmond Lee.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. I had gone into significant detail in two recent parliamentary questions and the exchanges after that, one on Ulu Pandan and one on Kranji, where I set out in a lot of detail the processes, both at the concept and master plan level, as well as the EIA framework that goes into the assessment of ecological and environmental impact. So I won't go into all that detail unless the member has specific questions on my answers the last two rounds. But broadly speaking, we have a long-term plan, or what we call currently the concept plan. I had told members of the House that we will soon be launching a conversation to re-look at the concept of Singapore, which will then input into our land use plan. But in finer granularity is the master plan. And in the master plan, you can see the different parcels of land, even land that's vacant or vegetated, and what the land use intention is for that land. But beyond that, this is an iterative process, it's a living process, and the different agencies that have land use needs like transport, parks and greenery, our water body agencies, our economic agencies, our housing agencies, having consulted their respective constituencies, the interest groups, the COS-based groups, members of the public, community groups, then discuss regularly to look at the land use and see whether to proceed with certain plans because of the needs that the agencies have forecasted, or to make some changes to the usage of different parcels of land. So for instance, over the last few years, a number of parcels of land that have been intended, say, for industry or housing, had, after discussion amongst agencies and with the input of members of the nature community and researchers, been safeguarded instead because of their ecological value as natural green spaces. Then, of course, from the environmental point of view, from the point of view of biodiversity, there is a nature conservation master plan that was launched in 2015, a four-pillar master plan, the first being the conservation of core buffers, corridors for nature. Second, species recovery and habitat enhancement. Third, scientific research into ecology science and its application in our ecosystems in an urban environment. And lastly, citizen science. And then, of course, I spoke also about the EIA framework, the processes that go into how to do an environmental impact study, when it needs to be called, and the kinds of agencies that are involved, as well as the enhancement we made in October of last year to put in place biodiversity impact assessment guidelines to enhance the standards and to put in place uniform standards for BIAs, as well as to provide for enforcement through the Wildlife Act and greater transparency of environmental studies. And I also talked about the new things that we have been working on, including an ecological connectivity survey at a high level with researchers as well as with nature community, as well as looking at the feasibility of centralizing EIA consultancy.